Some more news for you here. The Trump administration planning to appeal court rulings that prevented the revised travel ban from taking effect. This as we're learning more about payments from Russian firms to former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Let's bring back our panel. You got Jason Johnson, Abby Phillip, David Gregory. Abby, from a reporting perspective, what is the issue with Flynn? It's not so much where he was, what he was doing. It's about disclosure, right?
Yeah, and it's about a pattern of not entirely being forthcoming about his activities, both during the campaign and in the transition. There are a lot of questions about whether he communicated about these things to the campaign. I think we learned a couple of days ago that he did tell the campaign that he was lobbying, for example, on behalf of the Turkish government during the campaign, despite the sort of the plausible deniability from the White House on this. Michael Flynn has been, it seems, one of the few Trump aides to have the most sort of unexplained connections to either Russian officials, Russian companies, and so on and so forth. And the White House is having a little bit of a hard time explaining why that didn't become more of a part of the vetting process for him, becoming a national security advisor. That's one of the most senior national security positions in our government. He has had access to a lot of classified information throughout that process, and it's still unclear why they didn't take more of that information into consideration throughout this entire campaign and transition process.
All right, and so moving that forward a little bit, David Gregory, a top House Democrat on the Oversight Committee, has said, all right, this is the amount. Flynn was paid over $33,000 by RT, which is basically a propaganda tool for the Kremlin, to do this speech. We know he went there. We know he gave this speech in 2015. We know he sat next to Vladimir Putin because there's that picture of them both in tuxes, right? Now the guy doesn't work for the administration. Could the vetting have been better? Yes. So the question is, what does this mean for the administration now? Does this really matter in the final analysis of, you know, the broader Russia cloud hanging over this administration?
Well, I think the questions that investigators will delve into, and you talk about surveillance, clearly his contacts with the Russian ambassador were wiretapped. There was a transcript provided, and that's how his falsehoods were unearthed to the vice president. But these ties, you know, Flynn, who was a very reputable person in the Defense Department in the area of intelligence, was being relied upon by the Trump team as a campaign and by Trump himself. So he wasn't just a surrogate, he was an advisor, and then he became a very important foreign policy advisor and ultimately national security advisor. So what are all of those connections about, and to what extent did his contacts with Russia cloud President Trump's thinking, or how are they indicative of the approach to Russia? And maybe there's something even worse in terms of contact. So I think he's a little bit of the tip of the iceberg, potentially, that investigators are looking for in understanding that relationship between Trump world and Russia. There's not evidence that they actually colluded in any way, has been said before, but I think Flynn becomes an interesting piece in that puzzle.
David Gregory, staying with you, set the table quickly for us on how important these appeals on the executive order, the travel ban, are in terms of getting a win.
Well, I think the Supreme Court is going to have to decide it. I think the law is according to experts, really on the president's side on this, and ultimately the Supreme Court will have to get involved. So now, despite attacks on the judiciary, which is certainly not helping the administration, despite the fact that they're undercutting their own legal argument by saying this is just a watered-down version of the original, ultimately, I think, you know, we've had legal experts on the program who say that on the law, the president should prevail. So we'll have to wait for that.
Jason Johnson, to you, if you just look at the week, right, in summation and the full week, 2.0, travel ban 2.0, not in effect because of the courts now. By our count, 21 House Republicans don't like this bill and very well may not vote for it on health care. This has been quite the week for the administration.
You know, it's a typical week. I mean, you could say, wow, this has been a bad week, but think about it. Donald Trump gets caught lying. Republicans aren't happy with something he did, and a policy he proposes is dead on arrival. We've been seeing that since he got into office. It would be a surprising week if something he proposed did actually go through as an executive order, if he didn't have problems in the administration. I think the change is going to be maybe 6 to 8 to 10 months from now when he can actually get through a week and these sorts of problems don't happen. But this is typical. It's not a bad week. It's unfortunately
for the guy
par
he
for the
said
course.
he would get more done than anyone.
Exactly.
Right away.
Look, this guy got elected to bring back jobs. I don't see any jobs popping up this week. All I see are tax cuts and people who are going to be losing.
Had a good
federal
jobs
positions.
number in February.
He had a good jobs number in February, but are people going to feel that after this budget goes through? That's the problem. He's not doing what he got elected to do.
All right, guys. Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a good weekend.
And thanks to you, our